Arrangement is probably one of the most important parts of producing music. If you have the most pristine sounding production in the world, but it's less interesting than watching paint dry, I would argue that's not a very good production. But on the other hand, if you have a production that maybe sounds a bit scruffy, we'll say, but the way it's done is wildly interesting, I would argue that's overall a good production. See, a lot of home studio producers get in their heads that if it sounds pristine, then that's the goal. But really, the goal should actually be creating something that is interesting to listen to and then executed well. Of course, we want our music to sound great in terms of, sonics and the technical aspects, but there are so many examples of music that really does not sound like it was produced the best, but yet is loved by the masses because the song is so interesting. And this is the big mistake I see producers making. You're producing music without differentiating moment to moment. Now, what do I mean by that? What I mean is that so many producers wind up essentially copying verse 1 and then just kind of like plugging it into verse 2, or copying the chorus and then saying, well, we got the chorus done, we'll just kind of copy that over here and that's now our chorus too. And then they make that every chorus and nothing really changes. Now, obviously that's kind of extreme. Maybe you're not doing that. Maybe you're not copy pasting exactly. But here's another way that this actually happens. You have your verse 1 and then maybe you don't copy over those exact parts, but you essentially do the same thing in the next verse. So even though you didn't copy it, it's still basically the same. The way that I want to produce music is so that there is always something new coming up for the listener to experience. There's always some unique way that I want to do something so that when a new moment comes up, the listener is surprised. And maybe it's not even like a whoa surprise, but it's almost like having these small nuggets of musical goodness sprinkled throughout the song. I always want to save something for later so that as someone listens, there's always something to tickle their ear, so to speak. And this is how we make music that is differentiated. If you want to make music that people feel hooked to listen to, then repeating ideas over and over is a fantastic way of doing the opposite. Now, when I say repetition, that goes beyond just repeating an exact melody or exact chord progression. That could also mean repeating something sonically. So what I mean by that is you can have a unique verse, but everything about the production or the arrangement sounds too similar to everything else that has been heard. Sure, you're using different chords, it's a different melody, but every other part of it is the same. In other words, it might be different, but if you're using the exact same sounds, the same patterns, the same articulations with your instruments and such, then if it's not a direct repetition exactly, the result is kind of the same effect. It feels like a repetition. Something I do with my students is I will scrub through their song and then show them how every 15 to 20 seconds just sounds the same if this is a problem they're dealing with. So, I would go in my session here, I would start it up here, and then I would skip ahead to different parts in the actual song. And then I'm gonna see, does this sound pretty much the same as every other moment before it? And if so, that ain't good, right? So if you're listening to one part of the song and then skip ahead to another, and it sounds just virtually identical, that's a really big problem in my mind. And by the way, of course you're gonna find lots of examples where there is a lot of repetition. I'm not saying this is a black and white thing, so I don't want you to misunderstand me. There are times where maybe that is what you're going for. But just from a personal perspective and from what I see in the music that I think is the best personally, because we're all gonna have our own biases, I think this is how you should do it. You should be striving to have something unique for every moment. And I'm not talking about throwing a million things and overloading your arrangements so that it's actually confusing. That's not what I'm saying. There is a level of moderation, and the beautiful thing is that you can go extreme and make things wildly different, which can work. And that actually tends to be kind of my personal preference. But you can also be really subtle about it as well. So maybe verse 1 has a simple piano part. Maybe it's just simple block chords. But then verse 2 is the same progression, same melody, but instead of you approaching that piano part by just doing block chords, maybe now you're adding a rhythmic pattern. You're doing broken chords, you're arpeggiating things, you're changing up the pattern. Now that can be a relatively subtle difference. It's just pushing the arrangement forward a little bit. It's the same chords, it's the same instrument. It doesn't really come across as over the top, but nonetheless, it's different. Maybe it even just has to do with how you are voicing those chords. You're not just directly doing the same thing like, oh, all right guys, just put a repeat sign here. And that is a way of differentiating verse 1 from verse 2 with an instrument like the piano. Now you can do this by simply changing the pattern. You can also do this by changing the actual articulation. Maybe you have a guitar strumming pattern or a finger picking pattern, right? But what we can do is in verse 2, to make that sound more unique and differentiated from verse 1, well, we could simply change the articulation. Perhaps we're now gonna go to a palm muted articulation. You know what, let me show you. A little out of tune here. So we're gonna have a strumming pattern. Okay, that's cool, that's verse 1. But what about verse 2? Right? Now that's different. It's the same instrument, it's just a different articulation. I'm gonna put this away now. So let's actually take a look at a full production. Here's one of my songs. This is just gonna be the instrumental. We actually haven't tracked vocals yet, but it's a really good example, I think. So if we listen to verse 1, where everything starts, it sounds like this. All right, so we're setting the pace here. This has no drums. It's aggressive, but it's not like huge yet. And we're carving out some room for the vocal, right? So sound-wise, we've got this subby kind of dirty bass. We've got these muted pianos kind of doubling that, right? Just to kind of add some attack, some aggression. And then we've got this filtered out and pulsating sound. And then we've got this synth ostinato pattern here. It sounds nice, it's interesting to listen to, it kind of leaves you wondering, where are we gonna go? But what about verse 2? Let's go ahead and actually do this practice that I suggested, which is skipping ahead to different parts of the song. So again, here's verse 1, and I'm gonna skip ahead to verse 2. Verse 1. All right, let's go to verse 2. This is leading up to it. Heyo, right? Now there's still gonna be vocals in this, right? The melody's different, it's different, but this is a pretty extreme example, right? Like we've got this same ostinato pattern that kind of ties and glues this whole thing together. But then we go to a completely different articulation with the keyboard instrument, this plucked keyboard. Really attacky. It's kind of carrying over and gluing that whole aggressive thing from verse 1. So this is not like, hey, just completely change it up so it's like not even the same song. Of course we want to glue things together. We're going to have certain components that we want to kind of bring in, but it's recontextualizing it. But one of the biggest aspects of this that is completely unique are the drums and the 808. We've got all of this stuff going on in here, right here. Now, honestly, this is pretty extreme. This is super cool though. I wanted this verse 2 to be a huge moment. And I really want listeners to experience this like, whoa, what just happened, right? I want this moment to kind of turn some heads. That's really more my personal style. That's how I like things, okay? But then even if we skip ahead, this is still verse 2, but this is kind of like verse 2, but the B section of verse 2, it changes again. I'll kind of lead us into this a little bit. So this is a couple bars before. Here we go. Nice textural thing that changes the entire thing. We've got strings all of a sudden, listen to this. Tying and gluing that whole synth thing together, right? So there's a lot of things that are happening that are different, but I'm still gluing everything together. So there are some similarities, but it comes across as very different on purpose. And maybe you don't like this, right? You don't have to like this. This is a creative choice. But nonetheless, I don't think that anyone's gonna argue that this is highly differentiated from that first verse. The problem is that so many, now I know this might offend some people, but the problem is that so many people are either lazy and they just don't want to put in the work to actually do this by making it interesting moment by moment, or the more likely alternative is you just might not even know what you even can do in the first place to make these things different. So if you know how, but you're just being lazy, then stop being lazy. But I think really most of you are in the boat of really just not knowing how to make it different. So here's some simple things to try. First, instead of trying to make things wildly different, like in this example, focus on using the same instruments, but finding new patterns or new articulations to make each moment unique from section to section, like I did with the guitar. If you have like a sustained part, right, on verse 1, like just piano chords, then go for a more rhythmic part for verse 2. Try thinking in opposites. What is the opposite of sustained? Well, it's rhythmic. What's the opposite of soft? Well, it's loud. What is the opposite of whatever it is that you started with? And try coming up with unique ways to make those different. So in other words, don't try to reinvent the wheel here. Second is to try utilizing different sounds in different sections. This doesn't need to be like a full 180 where you all of a sudden go into a totally different, direction or a different style. It could be as simple as just changing 1 or 2 instruments for something different. If you have a piano, then maybe switch to another keyboard instrument or guitar or a synth instead, or strings, right? So you have lots of options that you can jump into. The core idea is that you are trying to deepen the experience by introducing new sounds, right? New sounds are a great way of keeping a production interesting throughout. If we look at this example, we have this muted piano that's plucked, right? That sounds like one way, but then I'm still using a plucked piano, which is a similar kind of sound, but the actual sound itself is completely different. Listen. There's distortion on it, it's super attacky, it's really compressed, all those things, so it sounds very different, but it's still kind of in the same category of instrument. So that's what I'm talking about. Use similar categories, but different sounds. And third is try zooming out and thinking about the whole song from start to finish and really ask, like, where is the biggest part gonna go? And where is the softest part gonna go? And aim to make each section dynamically different. Now this means that you're gonna be making each section unique in terms of perceived volume or intensity, which is something I did in this example too. Verse 1 has a lower perceived intensity, and then verse 2 has a really high intensity, right? And if we actually skip ahead to the bridge, check out the bridge. Completely different level of intensity. I use the bridge to really bring down the intensity and to add more of a swelling effect. So if you think about that bridge, right, the strings, and it's more ethereal, it's softer, it's really kind of more emotive. And you compare that to verse 2, again, very, very different intensity level. The main thing here is just thinking about how you want to differentiate your sections in terms of overall intensity and overall dynamic. If your song is the same dynamically from start to finish, I'm gonna be honest, it's really hard to keep things interesting without finding other ways to do that. So if you want to actually see how I go about planning this type of thing out and actually mapping out my productions and see how I approach producing from start to finish, I lay this all out in a free workshop where you're actually going to learn the production roadmap, which will definitely help you make sure that you're following a more structured way of getting this done. You can check that out right here. I'll see you in the next one.